Okay, so thank you everyone for joining. It's, as I said, cold. You can see how I'm dressed and I'm still freezing. Okay, it's Trevor. Okay, perfect. Hi, Trevor. Okay, so let's start. This week's Parsha again, like 2 weeks ago, is a double portion. Behar Bechukotai. Sometimes we get parshiot, we get parshas that speak to the individual. Sometimes we get parshas that speak to the nation. And then you also get parshas like this combined one of Behar Bechukotai that maybe even looks to be more ambitious. And that's really attempting to build or give us a structure of an entire civilization. So, not merely a religious people, not merely a nation with laws, but really what it's looking for, trying to build, is a society rooted in holiness, dignity, restraint, compassion, responsibility, all those good things. And we find that the topics that are spoken about in this combined parsha are quite numerous and quite vast. And they actually, on the surface, seem disconnected. So, for example, we speak about agricultural laws, Shemitah, and I'll come to that shortly. We speak about land ownership, slavery, business ethics, blessings and curses, and they all seem to be disparate themes, but actually, beneath the surface, we actually see that it comes to one central theme, or maybe one central question, and that who really owns the world? So that's really possibly what it's about. What the question is ultimately is who's in charge, who runs this world. That's what our parsha is really telling us about. And once we have the answer to that, once we know clearly that obviously the answer is Hashem, then everything changes, or should I say, everything should change. How a person earns his or her money, how he treats employees, how he simply views his wealth, how he uses his status, his power, how he treats those that are less fortunate, the vulnerable in society, how a nation sticks together, has unity, how a nation survives. And I think the most important thing always is how a Jew lives with faith. So the parasha begins with really the radical concept, and that is Shemitah. Shemitah, right? The parasha Behar speaks, says, V'shavta haaretz Shabbat la Hashem, just like in a week we have 6 days of work, and then we have the Shabbat, the seventh day of rest. Similar, says the Torah, is in the agricultural cycle, that we should have 6 years of active working on the land. And then on the seventh year, it should lie fallow. There should be no work done whatsoever. Shabbat Lashem, it should be a rest for Hashem. So again, if we think about it, every seventh year, the vineyards are abandoned. Produce becomes ownerless. So it's called Hefker, and anyone who needs is able to come onto your property and take. As I said, the fields are fallow, the live fallow, debts are released. We have the cessation of normal economic structures, right? Can you imagine in today's world, it would be like putting it on a WhatsApp, um, no planting, no harvesting, no normal business cycle. Whatever grows belongs to everyone. Imagine this is just publicized, and that's what it actually was in the land of Israel and is still today. But just imagine if that first mitzvah, the first time the Jewish people heard this. And again, if you think about it in today's time, if you put that to the rest of the secular world, economists, they would faint. Financial analysts would panic. What about inflation? What about cash flow? What about supply? And what's going to happen? What are people going to eat? What about property values? So all of these things are realistic questions, and it's questions that any economy would ask when they're told, for a year, every 7 years, don't work the land. Everything stops, the economic structure. But the Torah says exactly that. The Torah says stop. It says pause, let the land rest. Why? Because importantly, Torah is teaching us that endless production, right, just for the sake of it, is not the purpose of life. That's not what Hashem wanted us to do. a society that's only focused on output, what it's producing isn't going to have a soul, or it's going to at least lose its soul. And a person who can never stop working, just as the same concept in the week of Shabbos, is ultimately going to become enslaved to his work. If we don't ultimately remember who we are and what we stand for, we're going to totally forget what our purpose is. So Shemitah is not just merely agricultural legislation. It's not just Hashem through the Torah telling us that the land has to rest, but it's the ultimate declaration of faith. And again, think about it. This is a Torah that's given to a people, and all that the people know is agriculture. Right? Those times, we don't have the Jewish lawyer and the Jewish doctor and the Jewish CA. That's still going to come later. Here we've got farmers. Everyone, every Jewish person got his income, got her income from the fields, from agriculture. Now you're telling them to stop everything. So it's a real test of faith. And Hashem anticipates the question, what people are going to ask. And if you're going to say, Man nochal b'shana hashvi'it, what are we going to eat in the seventh year? Hashem understands. Hashem understands human anxiety. But Hashem at the same time tells us expressly that don't worry. Hashem answers, I'm going to extend my blessing to you. That's going to extend on the sixth year. So the crop of the sixth year is going to be able to produce for 3 years, the sixth year, the seventh year, and the eighth year. You have to have that faith that Hashem is going to be able to sustain you and actually give you more blessing than you would have had, otherwise. The Netziv, one of the famous commentators, he actually says, he explains that the blessing that Hashem is giving is not merely supernatural abundance. So maybe it's not a blessing of you're going to have much more than you ever need, but explains the Netziv, and it's quite a beautiful concept, is perhaps the blessing is that less is enough, right? And maybe that's one of the hardest lessons in life. We live in a world today where you're constantly being told, you're constantly being taught, I need more, I need bigger. When's my next cell phone contract being upgraded? When am I getting the new phone? I need to accumulate, I need to get more. But Torah, Judaism, our Yiddishkeit asks us, what is blessing is not always, it's not always having more. So you just mute someone. I don't know who the guilty offender is. There she is. Okay, don't worry, we still love you. So, what if the blessing is actually discovering that what you already have is enough? You don't need more. We all know that a person can absolutely have millions and still feel unsatisfied, still feel spiritually impoverished. And another person who lives modestly can absolutely feel rich. So, wealth obviously is not just what's in the bank, it's really what fulfills you, it's what fills your soul, what is your spiritual wealth. And ultimately, Hashem is telling us, and it comes in this week's Parsha as well, and it's a reason, a rationale that Hashem gives, Kili kol haaretz. Ultimately, the land is mine. I created the world, says Hashem. The world is mine, it's not yours. And again, it's a revolutionary concept because we think in this world that we possess, that we own. It's our house, it's our land, it's our properties. But the Torah teaches us there's not a concept of absolute ownership. And that's taught to us in the mitzvot of Shemitah, that the seventh year, let it lie fallow. And at the end of the 7-year cycles of 7 years, in other words, when we get to the 50th year, and that's called Yovel, not Yovel, a former wonderful Jewish suburb, but Yovel, the Jubilee year. And in that year, the land, even if it changed hands a few times, ultimately goes back to the original owner. So don't think that you're in control. Don't think that you ultimately own it. Hashem is ultimately in control. Yes, you may possess, you may build, you may develop, but you're never the ultimate owner. At most, you're a custodian. At most, you're a guardian. Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, he explains that this idea transforms, and you can understand why, all of society. Because if I believe that this is mine absolutely, then eventually what's it going to lead to? I exploit, I dominate, I become arrogant, I forget others. But if I believe that everything ultimately becomes from Hashem, then wealth is no longer a privilege, but wealth becomes a responsibility, right? It's no longer an entitlement. And that, of course, has ripple effects, and that has ramifications into the broader society, into business ethics, into charity, into leadership, into communal life, of which so many of those mitzvot are obviously spoken about in this week's parsha. And I guess if you want to maybe sum it up in one line, you can say that a Jew can own property without being owned by property. And that's really freedom, possibly, right? That's really what freedom is about, not letting anything dominate you or own you. I mentioned this in shul during the week, but I want to repeat it here, that Shemitah is definitely one of the proofs in the Torah that Torah is divinely given. In other words, that Hashem is the author and not man. Because can you imagine, this is Moshe who writes Torah on his own, and he says, guys, again, speaking to an agricultural society, a people of farmers, guys, on the seventh year, do nothing to your land. Do nothing to your land. But there's absolute promise. God's going to give you a bountiful blessing for the sixth year, the seventh year, and the eighth year. Everything's going to be great. Okay? They've accepted the Torah. But what happens in the very first Shemitah cycle where no blessing comes, right? Or the one after that, and everything is an absolute failure? No human being in their right mind would underwrite something like that unless they were absolutely certain that the blessing would come and no one would be impoverished and no one would be lacking and no one wouldn't have food on their tables. It could only be that Hashem, who ultimately knows what he is going to provide, can provide that. And we've seen throughout Jewish history when Shemitah has been observed that it's exactly that. There's been bountiful blessings on the land, and there's always been enough blessing. There's always been enough produce to be able to support the economy, to be able to support the people. We actually find Chazal, our rabbis tell us that actually one of the reasons they give for exile is the failure to properly observe the Shemitah, right? To properly observe the sabbatical year. Just want to quickly move on to the concept of the Jubilee year. So what happened in the Yovel year was that all slaves went free as well. Now, again, we have two different types of slaves. And remember, Jewish slave, it's not a concept of, trying to think of the right word here, ownership per se, or you've got a slave and now that slave is doing the worst work for you and being treated badly. A slave became a slave because he fell into poverty or he owed you something or he stole something from you. He didn't have the ability to pay you back. So in lieu of what he owed you, he sold himself into slavery. It was for a maximum of 6 years, right? And as we know, after 6 years, that slave went free. However, if the slave decided that it says, Ahafti et Avdia, I love my master, Beiti, and I'm quite happy to remain here. Well, then he can, but then he has to have his ear bored. He becomes an indentured slave, and then he remains in perpetuity as a slave. However, when Yovel comes, when the Jubilee year comes, no matter what year that is, could be in the third year of the 6 years, it could be in the 15th year in terms of the indentured slave, but everyone goes back to their natural state. They become free, they become liberated, emancipated. They're no longer slaves. And we have the phrase in this week's Parsha, because ultimately, Kili b'nei Yisrael avadim. Hashem says that b'nei Yisrael, the children of Israel, are servants to me. And again, our rabbis explain that a Jew cannot become permanently enslaved. Why? Because he already belongs to Hashem. Now, again, that concept shouldn't be seen as a negative concept, that we're a slave to God and God's punishing us and working us. But we're saying that we're owned by Hashem. Hashem gives us our role. Hashem gives us our mitzvot. Torah and mitzvot is like our instructions for the day, instructions for the week, instructions for the year, instructions for our life, just as a regular slave would have his duties to perform. We have the Torah and mitzvahs. And what Torah is saying, if you belong to Hashem, no human being may own you completely. But there's also a deeper layer, deeper level to that. If we think to our times today, and I've often spoken about this, that we may not think that we're slaves, right? We don't have to work for someone who's not giving us the right amount of pay. I'm not talking here about your normal employment contract, but are we perhaps, do we have our own self-imposed masters? Are we slaves to status? Are we slaves to addiction, to bad habits, to approval, to ego, anger, technology, comparison, keeping up with the Joneses? I come up with 5 or 6, 10, infinitely more examples of that. But are those masters that we are imposing on ourselves? And if we're saying that ultimately it's only Hashem, it's only Torah and mitzvahs that should really engulf us, so maybe use that word engulf rather than enslave, but if we're actively involved in the things that we should be involved in, well, then we can only be slaves in inverted commas to Hashem. We don't have the opportunity, we don't have the resources, the spiritual resources, or the time to allow ourselves to be entrapped by everything else, by the phones that we carry wherever we are. We think that we're so connected to everyone, because we've got 1,000 Facebook friends, but we're living in a time where maybe people feel more profoundly alone and separate than they ever have been before. So again, it comes back to the idea of what is true freedom in Torah. True freedom in Torah is not having no rules. It's not being led to do whatever you want. Because again, Hashem realized that if there's no boundaries, if there's no perimeter fencing, then you're going to fall into so many other traps out there. Hashem in his love gives us his Torah and mitzvahs as that safe playground, that safe parameter to work in. And we beholden to Hashem. Of course, within that parameter, we still have to do our work, we still have to be involved in the physical world, but we shouldn't accept foreign masters onto ourselves, and those foreign masters not only being of flesh and blood, but those foreign masters being of all the trends, all our bad traits and characters and things that we take upon ourselves, which obviously are so wrong. By the way, the concept of Yovel as well is the concept that I said before, that land goes back to its original owner, slaves go free. It's the concept of that there is a reset button. A person may feel that he's so set in his ways, you can't teach a dog new tricks type of thing. And Torah is exactly the opposite of that. Torah says at any stage, you can press the button and you can go back to be who you really want to be. So you've been slave for a year, 2 years, 3 months, 20 years, whatever it is. Don't think that that has to be your destiny from here on end. But no, at any time, just like in the normal cycle of years, there was something built into very nature that there was 7 years, and then there were 7 times 7s, ending in the 50th year of the Jubilee. We should know that at any stage, we don't have to wait 50 years. At any stage, we're able to go back and to try find who we really are, and to try reclaim ourselves, and to try give ourselves real ownership of ourselves, and that what obviously that we want to do. Quickly, I just want to move on, and obviously there's so much to be able to say on all of these topics. There's a beautiful verse in the mitzvah which comes straight after the laws of Shemitah and Yovel, and it speaks about, it says, Ki amuch achicha umatei yado imo vechezakta bo. When your brother begins to struggle and starts becoming impoverished, and I don't want to say becomes impoverished, because Rashi points out that even before a person falls, you should be able to be there and to forestall, I don't know what the correct word is, prevent that person from falling in the first place. And Rashi gives the example. He says, if the donkey of your fellow is struggling under its load, right? And it's about to fall. It's so much easier to put that load on the donkey properly while the donkey is still standing. Can you imagine now when the donkey's fallen? How difficult then is it going to be to lift the donkey up, to lift the load, reposition the load on the donkey? It's so much more difficult once a person's already fallen. We had a Farbrengen recently with Rabbi Karlebach, and he mentioned the word verfallen. It's too late. It's fallen. So what Torah says, when you're seeing the person already begin to stumble and fall, already then come to his aid, come to her aid. Don't wait for the person to absolutely fall, to be already lying down, to be in that terrible predicament, because it's going to be so much harder then to be able to support the person. And it's again interesting to see that Torah is not just saying give to the person, but the Torah is saying strengthen that person. And again, it's part of Maimonides' principles of charity and hierarchy of giving, that he also says that the highest form of tzedakah within the categories is helping someone before that person collapses. Again, I guess if you say even in medicine today, right, prevention is better than cure. So before the person gets absolutely bedridden with the sickness, where it's so much harder for the person to recover, when the person first begins to sneeze, give that person a tissue. In other words, when you see the person despairing, already come there. And again, it's not just speaking about a person who's impoverished materially with money. If you see someone lonely, strengthen that person. Of course, financially strengthen them, emotionally, spiritually drifting. Come there and strengthen them. By the way, you also learn out a very fascinating concept, often a difficult one for, let's say, a welfare organization like a Chevra Kadisha, who's obviously there to take care of many people in the community who obviously can't look after themselves. But Torah actually expects us that if someone was previously of a very high standing, and for whatever reason that person, that family fell into financial distress, you not only have the obligation to restore them to a situation where they function like the average person out there, the mitzvah of tzedakah goes as far as to even try to, again, to strengthen them, that they actually go back to their former position. Again, I said it's very difficult for a communal organization to obviously take on that kind of a responsibility. But if we, in our own personal positions, have the means to help someone, to not only prevent them from falling or to help them to restore where they were, actually to their where they were before, to their previous station, that's the extent that Torah expects us to go to for someone else. And obviously never underestimating the small act, the small kindness that we do for someone else. We may think that it's the smallest thing, whereas for them, we've really strengthened them. It's the biggest chizuk, the biggest strength we can ever give to that person is just the kind word, the smile, whatever. We never know how far they can go and how they can literally uplift someone. We also have the concept in this week's Parsha of not charging interest. Again, it's not the only time that is mentioned in the Torah. And we need to understand, why is it taken so seriously, right? Don't charge interest to a fellow Jew. And again, the concept is an obvious one, is that when someone is desperate, another person's suffering can become another person's opportunity, right? Unfortunately. And the Torah is obviously deeply sensitive to economic vulnerability. Judaism is not anti-wealth. And again, I've spoken about this so many times. Abraham was wealthy. Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe Rabbeinu was wealthy. So many of the authors of the Mishnah, the rabbis in the Gemara, were wealthy as well. So Torah is not saying don't be wealthy. Torah is saying that money should never replace morality. That with money, again, not only comes privilege and rights, but with money comes responsibility. And again, that comes back to what I said earlier about the idea that Hashem is the master and owns everything. Don't think that that land is yours, because ultimately there's going to be a period where it's ownerless. And ultimately, after 50 years, it's going to go back to its true owners. Maybe the owners had to sell it because they were destitute and they couldn't afford the upkeep of the property, or they just needed money to survive. The Jubilee year comes back and says, no, it's going back to its ultimate owner, because ownership doesn't just mean you're the richest person who can afford to own it. Everyone's entitled to be able to have something. So just as it applies to the idea of custodianship or guardianship over land rather than absolute ownership, the idea absolutely applies to money as well. That Hashem gives us money, Hashem gives us peace, God of Parnasa, and we have the obligation to give Maisa, to give a tenth of our net disposable income to those less fortunate. We have an income over and above that to give tzedakah, to give charity. Why? Because yes, Rodney, I've given you money, but there's a portion of money that I've given to you as well, but it's not for you. It was never for you. It doesn't form part of your bank account. That is to go into the tzedakah bank account. You're the custodian, you're the guardian. What are you going to be able to do as an emissary, as a shliach of God in dispersing that money? Because that's what you are. You're a distributor of money that Hashem's given to you. The difficulty in this week's Parsha comes in the second Parsha of Bechukotai. I'm just going to go through it very quickly. Is unfortunately the curses, the terrible things that Hashem says He's going to bring to the Jewish people. And that obviously follows the paragraph before it, which speaks about the tremendous blessings that Hashem's going to give the Jewish people in Bechukotai Telechu, if you're going to walk in my laws, with my laws, and not go astray. But when it comes to the tochacha, the rebuke or the curses, we should never, God forbid, think that this is revenge from Hashem. Hashem wants to do us in. But we should really see it almost as a built-in consequence, that mitzvahs have built-in consequences of reward. And unfortunately, the contrary is also true, that if you're going to contravene, there's built-in consequences, not revenge. So Torah is saying, Torah is describing what happens when a society loses its spiritual foundations. Then yes, what's going to happen is that collapse is going to begin subtly. We shouldn't think that the destruction happens suddenly. It never does, right? Civilizations decay slowly. If the first values weaken, morality blurs, you've got selfishness creeping in, trust collapses between people, the very leadership roles of the people deteriorate, you don't have unity anymore, you get fear. So all of these things happen, and then society implodes. And that's basically what the Torah is telling us. A nation can't survive on pure economics. Don't charge interest. Don't be harsh to the slave just because you're in a position of being master over him. You've got to realize that there's a responsibility. It's not on status. It's not on politics. It's through what our moral and what our spiritual purpose is. I'm just looking at what I wrote, what I typed out that I wanted to cover. This is one thing I want to end off with, because I've got a lot here that I'm not going to be able to get through. So maybe I should say this, is that if we look at societies where Jewish people have remained strong, right? And it's this great paradox and this great irony, is that where the Jewish people have remained strong spiritually has historically been where they've been under pressure, right? Where they've been the greatest pressure, that's where they've been the strongest religiously and spiritually. But when they've been in a sense of comfort and things have been good, then they've weakened. And why? And it's the unfortunate thing, but such a truism, that suffering forces questions. Comfort, when we're comfortable, we're distracted from those questions. So when life becomes too comfortable, people begin to believe. And it's the things I've spoken about now, that I'm okay by myself. I don't need community. I don't need meaning. I own everything. I'm the master of my own destiny. I don't need Hashem. And then what happens is slowly, of course, the whole concept of identity weakens. And it's not, paradoxically and ironically enough, it's not through the persecution, but it's through comfort. Previous generations had to fight and overcome so much to survive physically, but through surviving physically, they actually were able to survive spiritually. So we have to be able in our times where, thank God, we are living in a state of comfort. And that's the bracha that Hashem gives us in this week's Parsha as well, that He's going to give V'shochavti. You should be able to dwell in peace, but we should never, God forbid, allow that peace and allow that comfort to mask who really is behind it all. So it should always be absolutely front of mind, center of mind, that Hashem absolutely controls everything. Whatever we have in our life is from Hashem. It shouldn't be only in times of trouble we cry out to Hashem and we ask Hashem and we dive into Hashem, but it should be in times of good fortune, in times of comfort. That's when we should speak to Hashem as well and thanking Hashem and showing our gratitude to Hashem. Because if we ultimately realize that everything comes from Hashem, and that Hashem gives us, yes, for ourselves, nothing wrong for ourselves to be looked after, but that's not where it ends. You've got to be able to look after the other person there, strengthen him or her in times of difficulty. If a person is like a slave, but don't only read slave, if a person is in a vulnerable situation, you've got to make sure that you take care of that situation, that person, because Hashem's put you in that situation for a reason, right? The concept of hashgacha pratit, of divine and personal providence, not just providence that Hashem runs the world on a holistic level, but at a microcosmic level. Hashem's giving us people into our lives, putting us into situations every single day where we need to be able to make a difference. We need to be able to bring comfort. We need to be able to be a source of blessing to all those people around us, and ultimately remember what our mission is and who the ultimate master is, that and we are only the messenger of that true master, that being Hashem. Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim, because Hashem says, to me are the Jewish people slaves. Don't put other masters on yourself. Don't be slaves to everything else out there. You've got enough of Torah, you've got enough body of Torah literature and mitzvot to keep you busy, to be in inverted commas enslaved to. Just want to wish everyone a good night, good rest of the week, and please God see you all in shul over Shabbos. Stay warm. Have a good night. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Pleasure.